delighted to be sitting here with Heather again this time, and this time with good bandwidth, so we can see and hear you, which has been so important. So, just picking up on what Judy said, you know, your first book, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, was a key book and a bestseller, and that was followed up with your second book, Silke's Journey. Your third book, which Judy mentioned or spoke about, was Stories of Hope. And this is a different book altogether, as in it's not really a novel. All but one of the chapters has listening in its title. And having read it, I'm curious to know more about your thinking for this book and why there is a strong focus on listening within it.
Oh, hello, Colin and Judy, and thank you so much for having me back. Take two, as they say. The focus on listening. You know, this book came about after I had spent a day sitting in a very small apartment in Košice in Slovakia. I was there doing research for Silke's story, and I met throughout that day probably 30, 40 people, men and women, many of them elderly, who had known Silke for decades. Now, I sat there with them as they came in and out of this one apartment that this 93 and 96-year-old Mr. and Mrs. Samueli owned right next door to Silke's. And they were sharing with me these stories of Silke. Now, I don't speak Slovakian. They don't speak English. I did have two translators there, plus my publisher from London. And it was that evening that my publisher from London said to me, I could not believe what I saw today. And she's been around a while. She said, people just opening up and talking to you as if they'd known you all their life. She said, whenever I interrupted and asked a question, they just kind of looked at me and ignored me. She said, what was happening? What did I say? I said, well, I was just listening to them. She said, no, there had to be more than that. You engaged with them. So why was it different for you? And we started talking about how my great-grandfather, when I was a child, was who I considered the only adult in my life who not only listened to me, but who I also listened to in return. And he taught me about the importance as a young child to listening, to just shut up and listen. It's being the only way you will ever learn anything. And he wasn't talking about academic endeavors. He was talking about life. And yes, from that, I just started talking about all the different ways that I had found I'd listened to all my life. And I was working for 20 years in a social work department at Monash Medical Center, big hospital in Melbourne. Of course I had to listen. People didn't come to me in times of tragedy and trauma to hear me. They came there to talk to me and to get comfort and help, practical and emotional. And so once again, it was about listening. And it occurred to her, and she brought it home to me, you just do this naturally. That's how Lale told you his story, and how I'm currently getting the story I've got. And I guess I do it intuitively without realizing it, but it occurred to me that it's something that can be learned, and people around me are now picking up on it.
Yeah, I think it's so lovely to hear that, because it resonates a lot with the work I've done and the reflection I've had on my life, and why in different times I was successful in a sales role or in a customer support role, because I was intuitively listening and not realizing. One of the things you talk about in the book is about the difference between hearing and listening. And it was from what you just said then about that conversation with the publisher, she couldn't really grasp the difference between hearing and listening. She was just saying, well, what is it you're doing? And you said, I'm listening. And she's like, really? I mean, I was listening, but I wasn't getting that engagement. How do you see the difference between the two? Because I think for me, that's a really key differentiator to help people understand listening.
Well, one of the things she was doing differently to me was that she was taking notes. Now, I don't take notes, never. I remember, gosh, many moons ago now, when I was going to university, and I had learned at school how to write in shorthand. And I thought that I was going to ace all these lectures I was giving, because I was just going to sit there and I could write down verbatim everything being said to me because I was writing it in shorthand. And it wasn't until I then tried to write assignments and I looked at my notes and I could read it. I read the words, but I hadn't heard them. And I learned very, very quickly that difference between hearing and listening, which we were just talking about. How when you write things down, you just hear the words, you don't hear all the emotion behind them. You don't hear all that subliminal messages which have been coming at you in spades by people, because you're just concentrating on writing down words, which in and of themselves can often mean nothing. They're just words.
Yeah. And what I also notice, or the description I give, is that hearing is passive. It just happens. We don't have to do anything. But listening, we have to intend to listen. And so we'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about your preparation, but there is an intention there to listen. And when we do, we start to notice far more of the conversation, if you like, or what's all the things that are coming at us, the non-verbal clues and cues that are coming at us. So looking back now, and your time with Lale, what was it like listening to him? What was going on for you, and what did you notice about him?
Yeah, look, it changed over time. Initially, because he was a stranger to me when I met him, and the first few times I was with him, he was this incredibly grief-stricken man who he was just throwing stories and vignettes at me. Half of them were never complete and going nowhere. And I was very happy to just sit there and listen to him, never knowing if there was ever going to be a story come out of this. And so for that point, I was actually a little bit more detached, because I didn't understand what I was saying. It didn't help that, the bugger every now and then would flip out of English and start talking Latvian or Russian. Or he spoke 5 languages, and he particularly, I realized that when he actually got emotional, when he was starting to say something that was really painful for him, that was often when he would flip language. And I could look at him and see that he was now back in that place. He was there.
Yeah.
And so he would have been speaking German to the Nazis or Polish to the Polish people beside him, whoever he was with. If he was telling me that story, he went back to that place, and his eyes really would glaze over.
Yeah.
And I could see that I've lost him, but I haven't lost him. And I never once interrupted him and told him that I didn't understand. I knew that sooner or later he would just come out of it, and I'd say, "You're going to have to tell me some of that again. I kind of missed a part of it." And he said, "Oh, what was I talking?" And I said, "I don't know," because I don't speak language. So he often, when he snapped out of it, he realized that he hadn't actually been talking to me in English. But so those are some of the things that were initially happening for me. As I said, I let them ride. But that whole notion of when you're talking to somebody too, of knowing when to make eye contact with them and when to look away, when to look down and see what their hands are doing, when to look down and see what their feet are doing. Are they shuffling? Now with Lale, I always once again knew when he was getting really distressed, he would reach down for one of his doggies. He had 2 dogs that always sat at his feet. And I'd see his hand leave the table or leave his lap, and they'd go down, and he'd start stroking one of the dogs. And I knew then to just reach out and touch the other dog, or do something to keep that engagement with him, but not break the spell that he was in. So he was the incredibly different person to talk to than, say, the patients and their families who I spoke to at the hospital.
Yeah. And if I was to ask, what more brings up for you when you think of that? Because for me, just then, when you were experiencing, or rather when you were reliving that experience with him, I noticed a subtle shift in you as well, as though you were reliving it with him, reliving his stories. And even now, and it's some time since then, it's still, you're still connected to it.
Oh, look, thank you for absolutely. And yeah, look, he doesn't leave me. He knows, and I used to say to him all the time, "You're under my skin. You know, you are now part of me as much as my own family is." You cannot have that intense a relationship with somebody. And the difference also being with talking with Lale is that he was sharing stories and memories that he had carried for decades. This
Right.
was not something that had just happened to him recently. And so that pain in a lot of cases had actually grown and intensified, and he hadn't had an out for it. And when I contrasted that with going to work the next day and finding myself with a family who a family member of theirs had been struck down by either illness or injury where it was immediate, and they once again needed to just try and make sense of what was happening in the then and there. It's very different. So I'm having to make those two distinctions, and I definitely learned that with Lale being the first person I spoke to at length and over a 3 period.
Yeah. And just picking up on one of the things you said then, this was the first, you were the first person that he's had the real opportunity to share this, possibly with, oh gosh, what was his wife's name? Yeah, yeah, because obviously there was a connection there. But did you know, rather than put words in your mouth, what did you notice about him and his whole demeanor as he went through this, reliving this and then sharing it with you? Did that make any change to him that you noticed?
Yeah, look, it did. While he was initially talking to me for those, say, 2 or 3 months, he was quite factual and almost clinical. He could tell me storylines and tell me about events during the Holocaust that I possibly could have found reference to on the internet.
Yeah.
Such was the manner in which he was talking to me. But it was only after, I realized that he kept starting to say things and then would stop and pull back.
Right.
Like, okay, he can't go there just yet. And that's when I made the decision. It's not good enough for me to get to know you. You have to get to know me. And that's when I took him home and introduced him to my family. And that totally changed the dynamic of our relationship. But it changed it in the sense that he now became emotional. He now did openly break down with me and require a lot of comforting. But as that happened, it also started to leave him. And that's where I think you were hinting to before.
Yes.
When that trauma and pain, and in his case, guilt, yeah, he had survivor guilt. Every I ever met had it to some degree. And it did start to leave him. I could see that because, well, the most obvious thing to me was he stopped saying those words that put chills on me every time he said to me, "Hurry up, I need to be with Gita. I don't want to be here." And he stopped saying that. And he started saying other things to me, which told me that the pain that he had been carrying for over 6 decades was starting to leave him. He agreed to go out and have coffee. He made the worst coffee.
Yes.
So, and I said to him one day, "Can we go out and have a coffee?" And he said yes. And he left his apartment for the first time in probably 4 or 5 months.
Wow.
And then we started going out to coffee, to movies, to social occasions. I took on the role of his girlfriend. "She my girlfriend," she would say to my husband. "But she my girlfriend." And you could see it leave him. And he was now dancing around with one of his dogs was the size of a small pony. And catch him, he'd come in and he'd pick up Tootsie by her 2 front legs and he would dance around with her and skip. And I'm going, that's hazardous for a man your age. You should not. That was the beauty of our relationship. I could sort of chastise him for dancing with the dog.
Yeah, but I would guess you would say, well, I've been in worse places.
Too much, absolutely. Yeah. So we then take the dogs through.
But isn't it interesting how what you described there, somebody who's got been through very traumatic environment, been holding them for a long time, that through the real deep, active, empathic listening that you did with him, enabled him to get those out. He also, through your introducing him to your family and bringing him there, enabled him to go deeper. It felt as though it had become a much safer place. I know that could be sounding quite weird for people, but you know,
it was cathartic for him. It really was.
Yeah. What would you be doing that makes it safer, or how could it not be safe for you? But individually, we push against, and there are times, because he's been used to holding that all that time, to be able to feel that you are a safe enough place or safe enough person in order to relieve it, to let him speak it out, and to go deeper, and to let you touch or feel his emotion, his raw emotion, and still be there with him, is, I think, a real lesson for a lot of us in how do we help make it safer for our friends, our family, our colleagues, to relieve some of what's going on. And if we sort of bring it forward into the environment we're in at the moment, the pandemic, where we're on our own a lot, how can we work with each other to make it a safer place for each of us to be able to share what we're feeling, rather than just show up, stiff upper lip, typical British, but everything's okay, it's fine. But it's not fine. I'm really struggling.
It's quite the opposite. And one of the things that occurred to me just a few days ago, I was doing a talk and somebody asked me a question, which I don't think I've been asked for quite some time. And it's that safety, knowing that if you're telling me something, that I am not going to repeat it or gossip about it, and unless you give me permission. And somebody asked me the question, well, what if somebody does, share with them something which is deeply emotional and personal? What do I do with it? I said, well, you do with it whatever the person who told you wants you to do with it. There will be times when they may say to you, and this was once again played out in the hospital all the time, a wife may say to us something and about her partner who's in a bad way. And she would often say to us, will you tell my children? Will you tell somebody else? Because it was too painful for them.
Right.
It does come back to that whole gossip. And this person in this talk I was giving asked the question, well, how does Lale know that he could trust you to tell all his story? I said, what, you think you've got all his story? I said, no, you haven't. Because there absolutely are many things he told me, which he did say to me, please don't write about that. Please don't tell anybody that. So there's a whole side to this, well, not a whole side, but there are a lot of components to Lale's story that will go to my grave with me.
Yeah.
And he could only tell me those because he knew that I would be taking them with me and no further. Yeah. So it's trust. It's got to come down to trust.
Yeah. It's a beautiful place and a privilege, and privilege and a humbling, that when someone is willing and to confide in you like that, and to tell, almost to be completely naked in front of you. And this is all of me now. And that vulnerability it's something we feel is a weakness. If I'm vulnerable, then you're going to see me less or weaker. When in fact, as Brené Brown rightly talks about vulnerability, it increases the connection, it increases the relationship, which is good for both sides. And it's like, thank goodness I can tell someone. And
it's the exact opposite to weakness, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge strength.
Strength that so many of us actually don't have.
Yeah.
And we need to find ways to find it.
Yeah. And also, I think what happens is it gives permission for other people to share their stuff. And so there are times when I've done some work in the mental health arena, and part of the engagement is for me to share my story of times when either I've had mental health issues myself or been with someone who has mental health issues. It doesn't have to be long, but it's enough for them to say, oh my goodness, I can relate to that. That's what's happened to me. Or a CEO, as in one case, he just said, hang on, I'm going to go first. I need to let you know this is what's happened to me too. And you could see everyone go, oh my God, I didn't realize that. And I can now say what's going on for me, and it will be okay.
It will be okay.
Yeah.
Nothing bad is going to happen if you sit back and let somebody talk to you and you listen. Absolutely. And I tell you one little vignette in Stories of Hope about my working at the hospital. Clearly, you can appreciate that the work one does in hospitals is highly confidential, and so it's not discussed outside of your work environment. But I did share one particular storyline, and it's about a dad giving me a marble to put in his infant or his newborn baby's coffin. And that was an area I worked in. It's called perinatal loss in the hospital for 20 years, and that's what I did mostly. Yeah. Now, if ever there's a time when somebody needs somebody to listen and be there with them and hear them, absolutely hear them, it is when parents have lost a newborn baby. And I did that, as I say, for 20 years. And I do share this one little storyline because this was a dad who just openly let himself go with me and not only asked me to choose, choose a marble, or something as simple as a marble for his son's coffin. But as I say in my book, by the way, anybody watching this, it has a happy ending in a sense, because 2 years later, that father came back to see me with the photos on his phone of his newborn baby daughter who was only hours old. So see, this is it. He didn't have to do that. But that simple engagement that I'd had with him 2 years earlier and allowing him to absolutely dissolve and feel safe to talk to me about the death of his newborn son, that got paid back to me in spades when he came to see. Yeah.
It's very special, very special. I'm, as I know Judy knows, but I can't remember we've spoken, but my daughter is a children's nurse and working in A&E, and she doesn't quite face death on a daily basis, but it's quite regular.
Enough.
It's interesting that she's able to, when she meets with after the child has passed and she meets with the parents, then there is that empathic moment of showing empathy that I'm feeling this with you. And sometimes there's a few tears, sometimes it's a hug, but she's able to move with that into compassion, because there's a whole number of things that she, as you know, as a nurse, would need to do, such as, locks of hair, hand and footprints. And it's extraordinary how I was going to say how demanding. It's not demanding. There's a real joy in those dark moments that it actually brings, because you're in that position to be there with them. And I often talk about moving from do to be with. So you're really being with them, and that's so special. It's precious.
Yeah, you get to make a little difference. You're never going to take their pain away from them, but if you can make as much of a difference during that time, then you've done a marvelous thing.
Yeah, totally. I really, really get that.
Oh.
Talk about, we touched on it right early on, about showing up and about how you prepared yourself for arriving with your conversations with Lale. Can you share a little about what that's like and what things that you did mentally and maybe physically, I don't know what your practice was, to enable you to fully show up for Lale each time?
Well, to definitely not have any pen and paper in front of me. And also not even to have anything recording. I knew that even something to record him talking would be a distraction. So right from the get-go, it was, you get to listen and to be as relaxed as I could. We always, for the most part, we sat at his dining room table. He put me at the head of the table and he would be on my right. And so he chose those positions, and I let him. And to be able to just sit there with him, drink his terrible coffee and tell him how lovely it was, and then politely say no to another cup. It was a matter of allowing him to decide when he wanted to get up and walk away, because often he would get up and go over to a nearby side table and come back with a photo of Gita, a framed photo of Gita that sat right beside his TV. So if he was watching TV, Gita was there right next to it. And he would always, every time, he would pick that up at least once and bring it over to the table and just hold it to his chest. And it was more about just being with him there. And during those first times, as I say, he was clinical and factual with me, I kind of left him shaking my head a bit, saying, I wonder where this is going. And at one point, he said to me about, was I going to come back, and maybe he didn't have a story that I wanted to write. And I remember saying to him, I said, does it matter? Because I'm just enjoying being with you. Yeah. So if something happens, that became not important after a while. I enjoy being with you. And he returned that saying, well, yeah, and I like having you around. And my doggies like you. That was when he decided the one day that in fact, he would go deeper in talking to me, because his doggies, they did the right thing by me, by letting me throw the ball.
Yeah. I think that's such an important bit, that there's no agenda. If I end up writing a book about this, then I do, but that's not what we're here for directly. There's a lot which even just your presence there with him to enable him to open up and share and get things off his chest would have been enough. And also I get a sense, and it's a question that would obviously take a much longer time to answer, that when you're with him, as opposed to just being there, which is very different, then what I found is that the questions that I might ask, or the things that the other person might share, just emerge. You don't have to force it. Because of that, there's something about the energy that exists is almost, and I love the way you were sitting with him on the side, is both of you are almost putting your energy into this cauldron in front of you for it to emerge. And there's a sense of no time being, almost like time stops. So we're just here together for as long as it takes, and you get into flow. Yeah. It's a heart, for me, these things feel like a heart connection rather than a cerebral head connection. And the more you spent time with him, the deeper it was going to go. But I think for me, that's been really, really helpful.
Oh, absolutely, it did. And there were changes too that happened when he did start becoming really emotional, that then did start to affect me. It's impossible to hear that kind of horror and evil events that were played out and not get affected. And the first time it started to hit me was when I thought, okay, I'm making some notes at home about what he's telling me. Let me have a look and see how they play out when I go and do my own research. And when I started doing my own research, that was like an absolute kick in the guts. Because what I found out from researching it myself was that he, in fact, had downplayed that horror and evil. And it was an absolute, oh my God, this is so way worse than you're telling me. And I remember running back to him. He wasn't expecting me, saying, and shaking him and saying, Lale, it's worse. It was way worse. And him having to calm me down. He said, it's okay. I'm here. I survived. I said, but you just told me that, yeah, the SS were there and they were, they were making us walk around naked, and then they would take us to the left and the right. I said, that's not how it was it? And that was also part of when he went, okay, you know something now. And I have to admit that was also embarrassing for me to have to admit how little I knew. But so he just said, that makes you the perfect person. He said, you then believe everything I tell you. And I went, no, not everything, mate. I'm going to be checking it. Trust me. But, he was an absolute, what we'd call, he's a real character. Yeah. His humor came back, and he loved practical jokes, and he would tease me mercilessly. He was always telling me I wore too much lipstick. And apparently Gita didn't need to wear lipstick. So,
how lovely.
There was that, and then when it did get to a period when there's so much of what he told me did weigh heavily on my shoulders, and I found myself not wanting to go and see him.
Okay.
And I didn't go to him for, it was 2 weeks, and he rang me up at work, and I had a colleague in my office with me, and I just answered the phone, and this voice was just yelling at me, where have you been? Why aren't you coming to see me? And he was really distressed. And I mean, I'm at work. It could have been anybody on the other end of the phone, but I recognized his voice. And so I said to him, look, I'll come tonight after work. And that's when my colleague, who everyone of my close colleagues knew who he was and why I was visiting him, she said, what's the problem? I said, I'm just drained. Yeah. It's been 6 months now, 2 to 3 times a week. I feel exhausted hearing all his pain. And she kind of looked at me and just gave me a bit of a smack round the ear. And she said, come on, you know it's not your pain and your trauma to own. You do not get to own any part of it. And do what you love doing, spending time with him, and find a way to leave him and just take his pain, whatever he's given to you, out the door and get rid of it. But do not take it home. Because it also coincided with my family saying when I'd get home, oh, how's Lale? Every time, how's Lale? And I was just going, he's fine. I would give them nothing more. Yeah. And they were starting to get worried. So yes, if you're not careful, that transference can hit you and land on your shoulders, and you take it on board. Find your own strategies, not to own it, because it's not yours.
Wow, thank you so much. I mean, just listening to you and sitting here with you has been a wonderful experience, and I thank you for sharing both the words and the emotion that comes with it. And I've got a glimpse of what it might have been like during some of those times with him. Is there anything as a final message you'd give to people about listening, as a sort of like your sort of like leaving message, if you like?
I've got a book which I'm going to go back to in a moment and just finish doing a few more edits on, and it's going to be released in October. Now, this is another book that has required me to listen intently as I tell the story of 3 sisters, 2 of whom are still alive. They're now 95 and 97 years of age. Now, the sister who I never got to meet because Sibby died a few years ago, I had one of her testimonies when I was visiting the family in Israel. One of the, it was a niece of the sister who's died. She had there a printed testimony that Sibby had made, but it was all in Hebrew. And she sat down with me one night and she read this testimony, this book. And I did record that because there was nothing emotion there. And the very last words written in this book and spoken to me, the words of Sibby Mala, a 19-year-old girl who survived more than any person would ever have to survive. Her last words were, do not judge us. It's as simple as that.
Beautiful.
So whatever you're hearing, you don't get to judge.
That's wonderful.
Please,
thank you.
Please don't. Mm.